Yippee, you can't see me, but I can. Blazing in the foggy dew.
I think Floyd will always be remembered, one, the Syd Barrett period, which is the legend. Secondly, the Roger Waters period, which is an even bigger legend. And thirdly, the stuff afterwards, which will in reflection show to be just as good.
Watching buttercups come alight, sitting on a dandelion. No fear, you can't hear me, but I can you.
There was never one particular album where you could say Dave Gilmour was rotten. He's actually been consistently brilliant on every piece of work that they've ever done. Probably it's interesting to see what the marketing guys at Fender Guitars would say about Dave Gilmour, because we often hear about the great guitar heroes like Hendrix and Hank Marvin and others that have utilised Fender Strats. But in my humble opinion, there's actually been no one that's really exploited the Stratocaster sound like Dave Gilmour. His guitar sound is as identifiable as Hank Marvin's was 40 odd years ago.
His head did no thinking, his arms didn't move, except when the wind cut up rough and mice ran around on the ground. He stood in a field where barley grows.
Syd Barrett was probably the most important thing that Floyd ever happened to them. He's the one, it was his conception and his idea and mind that set the pattern for Floyd. Even though he left prematurely, it was his lyrics and things like Arnold Lane. That was really Syd Barrett. It was the phase one.
Syd was disintegrating slowly, but because there was such a wish to avoid dealing with it, I think we'd now call it denial. We wanted to carry on being in the band and doing bandish things like American tours and Top of the Pops and all the rest of it, and Syd definitely didn't. So what we did was pretend there was nothing wrong, and it was only when things got sort of really weird that we'd start, I won't say worrying about it, I think we worried about it quite a lot of the time, but quite a lot of the time he could be carried.
As Syd became increasingly unreliable and they couldn't rely on him when it came to concerts, because he would do things like standing on stage and untuning his guitar strings, while the rest of them frankly wondered how they could cope. The idea took root that they would bring David Gilmour in as a backup, as an additional guitarist.
Nick actually came to me and sort of nudge, if such and such happened, and if this and if that, would you be interested at all? And went through that whole thing in a sort of fairly roundabout way, suggested that this might come off at some point.
David Gilmour had actually taught Syd Barrett to play guitar, so he was a pretty natural choice to join Pink Floyd when they started having problems with Syd's reliability. And Pink Floyd have always kept it within their own, if you like. Most of the people in Pink Floyd, the Cambridge connection is very strong.
It was very difficult because we had decided at this point that what we wanted to do was Sid become rather like a Brian Wilson, if you like, and stay at home and write, because we knew by then it was impossible, he couldn't perform on stage. So I had to say things like, Sid, I'm going out to get some cigarettes, and then go off and do a gig and come back the next day. And it was awful. I mean, it was a terrible time. Eventually, of course, he understood what was happening.
So what happened? I mean, was he sort of asked to leave or booted out?
Oh, I think we were doing gigs and we just stopped going round to pick him up, really.
Really?
Eventually. I don't suppose he even hardly noticed at first.
I think the 5-piece, I would have really loved it to have worked. When you see the photograph of the group with the 5 of them, and they all look beautiful, and considering Sid was sort of quite damaged by then, obviously he looked haunted, but he still looked very much sort of part of the band. And I think it was this measure of a little bit of desperation, because they had a guy that, they didn't know what he was going to do every night on stage. They didn't know if he was going to perform in the studio, but they still had this mercurial genius. So trying to play him in this sort of Brian Wilson role, the writer behind the scenes, I actually think was a fantastic idea, and it's only a shame that it lasted quite such a short period of time.
No, I don't think they knew where they were going at all. When I joined, I think it seemed to be like we could maybe, how should I put it, maybe milk a bit more out of a dying thing, which is what we've been doing ever since, according to some. But no, the direction started taking place quite quickly after I joined. There was a direction that seemed to start coming forward, but I don't think that started till after Sid had gone. I don't think it was possible to really think of much of moving forwards while Sid was still there.
It's interesting because I think Gilmour's influence in the early years of Pink Floyd is musically is quite negligible. I think what he certainly brought was a very sort of steady hand on the tiller, where they'd been used to having this maverick, which they weren't sure what they were going to get from him. I think initially he was quite stifled creatively, yet you can hear over the first sort of 3 albums he's on where gradually he's sort of finding his feet. So I think more it was a sort of calming influence and the ability to play what the other guys wanted him to.
The title track of Saucerful of Secrets, which is the longest track on the album, it's about 12-13 minutes, and David Gilmour's contribution is very strongly felt there. Again, it's a formalised piece. It may have, it's got periods of improvisation and wild drumming and things like this, but in the end there's a formal structure to it. It's almost a sort of a work in 3 parts. And David plays his part in that.
The title track, Saucerful of Secrets and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, definitely hint at what was to come. Their continued exploration with sound effects, which were a great thing, and the extended themes were absolutely brilliant. I think what is interesting to point out is that at this time they were getting sounds out of equipment that was readily available to anybody. and yet making the equipment sound totally different. Bearing in mind that technically guitar amps, guitar effects weren't anywhere near as intricate as they are today. I think it's quite remarkable some of the sounds that they were extracting from their gear back then in 1968.
I think it's interesting because on Saucerful you have to sort of struggle to hear him, and I think his first period in Floyd was characterised by this sort of strange mixture of trying to be Sid, maybe trying to be Hendrix, and also trying to be himself. I think where you do hear it, and it's great, and it's quite almost lost in Let There Be More Light, there's this solo at the end, which is this mixture of what becomes a David Gilmour guitar solo with him doing a Syd Barrett guitar solo. So I think that's the first time you really notice him as a guitarist.
It's debatable whether or not the album was as good or better than the previous one. If you talk to fans all night long, they'll argue and they'll change their mind about which was the better one. But it was certainly the end of an era. You would no more see the style of some of these unusual songs that Syd Barrett had contributed. And it seemed very much that it was, okay, that's the end of that particular era of Floyd. And interestingly, now we move into the future where things got far more entangled.
As soon as Syd left, we had to find a different way of doing it, and that was, part of the way that we saw to go forward was with lots of rather strange experimental stuff. And it seemed to us that as long as these records earned enough to pay back the recording costs, which they always did, it was fine for us to keep doing that.
Set the controls for the Heart of the Sun. This is where they took off. They had the whole thing, for me, Ummagumma, everything from the album cover through to that. This was Floyd, first gear, getting set to become massive. The band started to get a sound. It was early, but they started to get a sound. They started to, Gilmour with the guitar sound, and everyone started to get their own little niche in the band, and things started to maneuver a bit, and they started to find their way, and you were getting a Floyd sound from the early days with Syd. They'd done things in between, which was like, as you say, the soundtrack stuff, which was probably a good buffer while they started to get themselves together as a band.
Well, this was a mixed album that came out in October '69 with 4 live tracks and a series of individual solo pieces from the 4 members of the band, which gave them all probably their last chance individually to stretch out. The Narrow Way, which is the 3-part suite of Dave Gilmour, is very, very effective with some great guitar work.
The Narrow Way is a curious piece, as is virtually all of the 4 solo pieces that make up the studio side of Ummagumma. I think it's distinguished by being possibly the least throwaway. And the third part where he sings actually resembles some of the sort of epic Floyd sweeps of sort of 71 through to 75. But apart from that, it occupies a place on the record.
Gilmour was probably yet another version of something that we ended up doing for about 30 years, which is called What the Hell Do We Need to Do Next? And a live album obviously is relatively easy, but the studio album, the idea of dividing it into 4, was a sort of, I suppose, an easy way out in a funny way, that it just gave everyone the responsibility to do 10 or 11 minutes each. And interesting, but actually a very poor album in terms of a band album, because what you get is actually the individuals rather than the sum, and the sum, of course, tends to be what makes a band really work.
See the splashing of the kingfisher flashing to the water. A river of green is sliding unseen beneath the trees. Laughing as it passes through the endless summer, making fall asleep.
Whether or not it stands up by the standards of later albums, is still a very important album to Floyd fans. And it's a nice thing to have, because you've got the mixture of live material and studio material. And it's probably one of the last big noticeable contributions individually from the band. I still love it. I think it's great.
I think it's very easy to, and I think this is why some people always will have a problem with David Gilmour, that where he's had Sid before him and Roger Waters being these sort of quite definite frontmen and having their quite definite sort of ways and experimental edge and things like that, I think Gilmour fitted in with all the experimentation very well, but you always sense that he'd much rather be playing a well-written song, and he'd rather be singing a good melody.
Look back on it now, on the Atom Heart Mother period, and I can see where the progression is going from Saucer Full of Secrets through Atom Heart Mother to, say, Echoes on Metal. And there is a sort of progression that you can follow what we were trying to get at. But I would not say that Atom Heart Mother was at all a successful one, really. It's not something that I have any great fond memories of.
Metal was released in November 1971 as the follow-up album to Atom Heart Mother, and the fans were seriously behind the band now. One of These Days features some searing guitar work from Dave Gilmour, which is right up there with the very best solos he's ever played. It does also contain the track Echoes, a mega track that was used in the Pompeii film and was arguably the first of their great masterpieces. Echoes was absolutely brilliant.
Overhead the albatross hangs motionless upon the air, and deep beneath the rolling waves, in labyrinths of coral caves, the
I think in some ways Medal's the one where they really found their direction. They knew what to do, and I think David Gilmour in particular found his role as the guitar player in Pink Floyd much more in Medal, and that set him up for Dark Side of the Moon, because the long piece, Echoes from Medal, is very much a Gilmour tour de force. It's his notes, his sound effects really, that bind that whole piece together, a whole 20-minute piece that took up a whole side of an album. And I think after they'd done that, Gilmour had the confidence to know that what he was doing with the band was what they wanted and what they needed.
We were really casting around looking for a start to a piece of music, and I think it was really finally when this sound was, I think, really turned up by Rick, this sort of almost Aztec pinging, and it was just such a sort of extraordinary noise. It just was something that fired the imagination of everyone else into turning up a piece of music.
By and large, it stands up as still being the first of the big three most successful musically and commercially of the Pink Floyd albums. Dark Side of the Moon is the last album where they're truly a band, and not that they were ever a band in the sense of, you know, the Gang, the Beatles or anything like that, but I think that was the last album where the four parts really contributed equally. This was the point obviously where Waters began to bring in the grand concepts, and, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, he was the best lyricist in Pink Floyd. That said, Gilmour was absolutely passionate about getting the music right, about getting the whole sound and the whole feel right, and very much a professional when it comes to playing. And I think it was at this point where Waters and he began, not that they were ever the fastest of friends, but I think Waters would be having his high concept and Gilmour would be wanting to get on with it, and therein, at that point where they were a four-piece and it was all gelling, the project became the thing and it didn't necessarily matter so much. Later on, we know that it became something more of an issue.
There were things on Obscured by Clouds and Medal where Roger was really starting to try and write stuff that did mean something and was relevant to people and situations. I was the guy who had to sing most of this stuff, you know. I was the singer previous to that, and on most of Dark Side of the Moon I'm the singer. And it's a vast improvement. It's much nicer to be able to sing about something that you agree with and you believe in than to sing some of the other stuff that we'd done earlier, which was, some of it was embarrassing to sing, to be frank, you know. And so I was in absolute full agreement with doing it. It was definitely progress, definitely a move forward in my mind. I concentrated personally on trying to make sure that the music lived up to it, because Roger in his sort of moving forward in that way lyrically would sometimes forget that the music had to be good as well. And I think the music started taking second place to him. The more he got into that lyric thing, the music started, on some occasions, certainly not on all occasions, but on some occasions the music started taking second place, and I sort of considered it my responsibility, if you like, to make sure that the other sides of it stood up just as well.
Everybody pulled their weight on that album. That is partly what makes that album what it is. The fact that everybody pulled their weight, that they inched towards what it was that they were looking for, but they were all looking for the same thing. so that as the ideas came out, all of them embraced them. So when Roger had the idea of suddenly asking people questions about what they thought of the moon and madness and things like that, the others all contributed questions. That was very much a team effort. There are several songs which are Gilmour and Waters co-compositions, that they leaned off each other. There was still this feeling that, all right, you've got that bit of melody, but I've got a guitar line that's going to work with this, and so it becomes a part of the song. That's partly why Dark Side of the Moon works as well as it works, because all of them had that focus. They knew that they had the idea, they pushed it through. Obviously they had no idea just how big it was going to be, but they did have an idea that they were onto something, that this was, in a sense, it was a culmination of what they'd been groping towards for the previous 3 or 4 years.
We would do about a track every day or every couple of days, more or less, to finished. Far, far quicker than we ever do anything these days. Then the joining it all together and the effects and all the interviewing people to get all the voices and all that sort of stuff took quite a long time. And as it neared its completion and all the bits fell together, all the effects and the voices and all those things became glued together, it was obvious that it was light years away from what we'd done before.
I think a lot of the people that had heard the first 2 albums, Saucerful and Piper, had dismissed Floyd as being that kind of band. So for a lot of people it took a while for them to take notice. A lot of people had disregarded metal, but when Dark Side of the Moon came along, it converted a lot of people, and I think that was the album that converted fans for life. There's no doubt about it. Once you bought that album, you were hooked.
So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pale? Can you tell a green field from a cold steel rail, a smile from a veil? Do you think you can tell?
Wish You Were Here album was released in September 75, and stands, in my humble opinion, as the last of the big 3 after Dark Side of the Moon. It was no disappointment to the fans that came along.
I think we were probably flailing around. Yes, I think there was fragmenting going on at the time, absolutely. But there was also, the business of follow-ups to Dark Side, and there were probably things going on in our home lives as well.
Wish You Were Here is always going to be tough, because you're following an album that's massively successful, i.e. Beatles following Sgt. Pepper with the White Album was brilliant. Floyd following Wish You Were Here, or following Dark Side of the Moon with Wish You Were Here, I think it's a great record. I think it's a really, really good. I love Wish You Were Here. I think it's one of their best records, and I know a lot of people that think it's better than Dark Side of the Moon. Dark Side of the Moon was a great, great record, but if you listen to Wish You Were Here, the production actually is a little bit slicker. The sound of it, when I put it on for the first time, I thought, yeah, that's really good. It's got all the Floydisms in it, but they're presented better, the stereo sounds better, the tricks are better. That's what I liked about Wish You Were Here. To me, it was a better produced record.
How I wish you were here. We're just 2 lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. What have we found? The same old fears. Wish you were here.
I would say that when you look back at all the records, Wish You Were Here is probably the one you would associate the most with Gilmour, because here again, that Waters needs Gilmour and Gilmour needs Waters, because the playing and the lyrics on that record are still astonishing. You still listen to them and think, they could have been written yesterday, they could have been written tomorrow. And I think Gilmour's playing is what elevates it, because that guitar figure at the start of Shine On You Crazy Diamond is probably the most recognisable piece of Pink Floyd music worldwide, and it's absolutely breathtaking.
The sound again is monumental, and it cannot have escaped anybody that it really is a tribute to Syd Barrett. Shine On You Crazy Diamond ranks alongside anything they've ever done, including Dark Side of the Moon. And features arguably the finest guitar playing that Dave Gilmour has ever come up with. That wonderful drone at the introduction, which seems to go on interminably, and then those lovely guitar licks. And then I think it's around about 3:55 comes in what many Floyd fans consider the most important four notes in Floyd history. Shine On You Crazy Diamond is probably my personal favourite of everything they've ever done.
Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun. Shine on, you crazy diamond. Now there's a look in your eyes, like black holes in the sky.
I think the way that Gilmour really took a great deal of time and a great deal of effort to make that record sound right means that his contribution is very much equal to Waters on it.
If you didn't care, what happened to me? And I didn't care. But you.
I think Animals is a very interesting entry into Floyd's discography, because it doesn't really sound like anything that came before and not really anything that came after. It was the start of Waters' control, sort of complete control of the band, and the melody count wasn't sort of rocking through the roof, and Gilmour was a man that enjoyed a tune. And I think there was some despondency at that point. I mean, considering sort of 2/3 of the album had been around for a couple of years anyway, by the time it came to record, the band had become very big, and it was a question of sort of, where do we go now? And his contribution is slightly minimised. That said, where you hear him, his guitar solos on Dogs, and obviously the solo at the end of Sheep, which is probably one of his career-defining guitar solos, shows that he was always ready to perform when the moment came.
A lot of fans also cite Dogs as having some of Dave Gilmour's best guitar work, particularly in the last 3.5 minutes. You say the last 3.5 minutes, that shows how long each of those tracks were. He does some great harmony guitar playing in this. And while Animals may not have featured archetypal great songs, if you like, his playing was never less than faultless.
It's not as broad an album, I suppose you could say, in appeal as some of the other ones have, but I like it a lot.
I didn't really like a lot of the music on the album. I have to say I didn't fight very hard to put my stuff on, and I didn't have anything to put on. I mean, I played on it, and I think I played well, but I didn't contribute to the writing of it. But I think also Roger was kind of not letting me do that. This was the start of the whole ego thing, I think, in the band. Animals.
The Animals album is Roger Waters beginning to take over the band in no uncertain terms. Rick Wright and Nick Mason were happy really to do what they were told. So was Dave Gilmour to an extent. They were a pretty placid bunch, it must be said. But David Gilmour felt that in the studio he did have more of a role to play. And I think perhaps this is where he found he was starting to be overridden more.
I can't breathe anymore. Why that is, I'm not sure. Got my feet on the ground. In fact, I'm flat on the floor. My direction is lost. I should pause to take stock. It's a new one on me to even dream that you're free.
It's interesting that the two members of Pink Floyd that rushed to make the solo albums were Rick Wright and David Gilmour in '78. The two members who, for many, their vocal blend was Pink Floyd, and the image of Live at Pompeii with the two of them singing Echoes, they were like Pink Floyd's leaders to the untrained eye. But obviously they weren't, and the world had turned, and that both their contributions had been minimised. And the thing with Gilmour's solo album, he went over to France. It was done in a really short period of time. He hooked up with two old mates from the old days, and he said it was a blast.
I know that I really will.
Pink Floyd albums were no longer giving him the creative outlet that he had had before, because Roger was dominating the songwriting and was also starting to dominate the arrangements. And Gilmour was finding that he could add less and less because Roger Waters was accepting less and less. He had more and more of his own idea about the way this was developing. So this would have spurred David Gilmour to make his own album.
It's not the most robust piece of work you'll ever hear, but it showed that he had, is very melodic. The instrumental Millace that opens it shows that he was as much a keeper of the Floyd sound, in fact more of a keeper of the Floyd sound than Roger Waters was. And interestingly enough, he composed what became Comfortably Numb whilst making that record. So I think it was a very good sort of cobweb clearing exercise. And the whole thing was quite down home. And I think that's one of the main contrasts always between Waters and him, where Waters is all about the grand spectacle and Gilmour's all about getting your jacket off and do it here and let's cook up a little jam and see what happens.
the audiences we'd always had been so quiet and respectful, and suddenly we'd got hit single audience who just shouted for money all the way through, and you just couldn't get away with some of the quiet pieces of music that we'd done previously, and it was the end of an era. It was the beginning of another era, but it was the end of an era as well. That huge success thing, it prevented certain things, and that's just life. You just couldn't do some of the quiet bits, quiet, beautiful interlude bits that we used to like doing. The audiences before, you could hear a pin drop in our gigs. It's absolute silence going on because they were listening to these tiny little things that we used to do. And when Dark Side of the Moon was that big, suddenly there were sort of 50,000 people in front of us instead of 10, and half of them would be young kids up the front shouting for their favourite songs. We'd never had that before, and that was really, we didn't like that. I hated it, and that probably is the start of the separation.
They'd shout for what they wanted, or their favourite songs, or whatever. And you could, inevitably, and quite rightly, Roger was pretty distressed at the fact that they weren't listening to the music.
We did stadiums that whole tour, and I was fed up. I didn't like playing in stadiums at all. I felt very alienated by everything. In that situation, you have to wall yourself off and ignore the fact that you're in a bad situation for playing music and it being listened to, and concentrate on the money and ignore everything else. And I was unable to do that. And so towards the end of that gig, there was some poor kid climbing up the chain link fencing in front of the stage, screaming his head off when I was trying to sing Pigs on the Wing or something. And I finally flipped, and I leant down to the front of the stage, and I sort of beckoned him closer, and this poor kid came clambering closer and closer, yelling his head off, and I spat right in his face. And I thought, what's happened to me? And I was very depressed after that. And the thought came to me that of putting on a show with a rock band and actually constructing this wall that I felt really desperately at that time, actually physically building it as a theatrical device across the front of the stage.
Roger came to us with two concepts, the wall one and another one, and we liked the wall one as being more interesting. It was not an easy demo to listen to, and a lot of the stuff got changed, thrown out, and new pieces put in.
I don't think on the wall he was a session musician. I think you could argue that for the final cut. I think for the wall he was still fighting his corner. I don't think he ever quite sort of rolled over and died, because Pink Floyd were incredibly important to him. And in a way, he was the person that was actually keeping Pink Floyd, or the fans' view of Pink Floyd, alive, where Waters was taking it somewhere else. And I think you just have to look at his, 2 or 3 co-writes on the wall. They're probably the best tunes. And again, as Waters' voice developed into greater mannerism, Gilmour's voice was the perfect complement, and obviously none more so than Uncomfortably Numb, which is, if you just want one track that sums up the two of them, it's that, because you've got Gilmour's incredible sweetness and Waters' incredible barbed mannerisms, topped off with an incredible lyric and one of the best guitar solos you'll probably ever hear.
Show me where it hurts. There is no pain you are receiving. A distant ship smoke on the horizon. You are only coming through in waves. Your lips move, but I can't hear what you're saying. When I was a child, I had a fever.
Gilmour did add a couple of significant contributions to the wall, most notably, of course, Comfortably Numb. That is his song, which was adapted by Roger Waters and turned it and who put new lyrics to it. But if essentially it's David Gilmour's song, and you have to say it's the most melodic song on the album, and it's the one that it's the one song you can hum or sing. Most of the rest of that album is pretty unhummable.
We started putting down the demo stuff for that in 78 and late 78. And no, I was very, very involved in it. I mean, I worked my butt off for a year on that record. I co-wrote 3 of the songs. I wrote all the music for Comfortably Numb, all the music for Run Like Hell, and part of the music for Young Lust. And did an enormous amount of production and arrangement work on that album. And of course it is something that bugs me slightly, that people tend to think that it's a Roger Waters solo album, which it just certainly isn't. You know, there's a lot of hard work went into that by all of us.
Well, originally nobody was allowed to write on the album at all, and we literally had a battle over Comfortably Numb, for example, which I put my job on the line for. I said, you know, if this doesn't go on the album, I leave, because we need this song. This is like, to me, this is a hit song, and we need to have it. And also, it's very much a part of Pink Floyd that Dave Gilmour be a musical contributor to this. He can't just be a sideman. And I had to fight for Gilmour's involvement, and it took a while to get Gilmour into it, because at first it was kind of like Roger's baby. It was almost Roger's solo album.
I don't fully agree with the concept of The Wall. To me, it's more a catalogue of complaints, and I don't want to blame everything in my life on everyone else in my life, not myself. I think it's too complaining myself. I think there is some wonderful stuff on the album. I mean, I think there is some optimism and stuff inherent, because that's one of the wonderful things about music, is that you can have a rather doom-laden lyric on top of an uplifting piece of music, and it juxtaposes it, and it gives you a feeling of uplift about it. I think the film definitely got too black and bleak, but as I say, I don't fully concur with everything Roger says on that. I believe some parts of it are very good, but some parts of it are sort of a bit myopic to me.
Show the prisoner who now stands before you was caught red-handed showing feelings of an almost human nature.
I think Richard Wright sacking from Pink Floyd is quite interesting, because it happened during The Wall, but the wider world, I mean, this was a time where, you know, Pink Floyd, no one in Pink Floyd spoke to the media, not like it became. And the only wind we ever got of this was when the final cut came out, and suddenly there was only 3 names on the back sleeve. I think Wright was fairly aggrieved that he wasn't making the contributions that he once did, and as a result became sort of quite disinterested in the whole recording process. And the one thing with Gilmour is that if the job is on, the job is on, and there's work to do, and you know, he will do that. So I don't necessarily think he was completely behind it, but I don't think he necessarily shouted loud to keep him in the band.
Richard had been doing less towards what we were doing together, over a period of time. For some reason, I think he was not entirely happy with the type of things that we had between us agreed to do. And by the time it got to making the Wall album, he'd certainly more or less stopped. And it was inevitable that he would have to go. What do they say? Musical differences or mutual disagreements? He'd just had enough, I guess.
It wasn't a happy period, but by then relations had disintegrated pretty badly within the band. It was very much Roger Waters' show. In fact, they'd had to get producers in. They got Bob Ezrin in as a producer to try and find a middle way through what was becoming a morass.
The psychological terrorism that sometimes was going down in the studio was so overwhelming, and often you could cut the atmosphere with a knife, it was so thick. The resentment was never directed exactly towards me because I was a collaborator. It would often be directed towards me because I'd asked for something that somebody wouldn't want, or because I disagree with something that somebody wanted to put forward. I think in the very beginning, my biggest problem was with Roger, the very guy who brought me in. And in fact, he and I locked horns on the first day. And there's an incident that Dave Gilmour still cites to this day as being the moment that he knew that I was going to be good for the band, was when Roger disagreed with me on something, and I looked at him, I said, "Read my lips, mother, you-know-what." I said, "This is the way it's going to go." And Gilmour he said that he was just applauding inside like a little kid, go whoopee whoopee, somebody that's going to stand up to Roger. Everybody expected Roger to jump all over me, and he didn't.
I think it had got to a point during the final cut where it can be safely said the two of them weren't really communicating. Gilmour wanted to take another month to actually write some of his own material, but Waters had such a bee in his bonnet to get this material released, quickly recorded and released, that he went ahead. And effectively, working with Michael Kamen, it was a solo album where Mason and Gilmour came in effectively to do their bit. That said, Gilmour's contributions on it, where he does sort of break free on a few solos, you still know Dave Gilmour's very much there. And when you hear his voice finally come in on Not Now John, it's like this beautiful relief that he is here after sort of 40 minutes of Waters, at his peak. And I actually love that record. I think it's a very interesting album, but shouldn't really be in the Pink Floyd canon.
This album, which deals very much with Roger Waters' feelings about war, his father, everything else. A very dark album, a disappointment to a lot of the Floyd fans at the time. And I think it was obvious then that something was going to give. And this was really about the time of the end, if you like, of that classic era of Pink Floyd.
He had written all the words. I mean, all the words were his stuff. That's the way he wanted it, and we were perfectly happy to go along with that, because but my budding lyric writing thing that I'd done a few in the 60s and early 70s and stuff, and my solo album stuff, but I had had very little practice at it, and I feared and still think I'll probably never get to be as good as Roger.
I think we'd all absolutely had enough of working with each other. The Wall had been an enormous sort of effort, and not only had gone on for a long time with films, movies, Book of the Film, Son of Wall and all the rest of it. By the time we got the final cut, that was another development of the Wall. I mean, that was meant to be the final Wall. And I think also that by then Roger was doing so much of the writing, so much of the work, that he was feeling that we weren't pulling our weight, and we were feeling frustrated that there was nothing to do. So I think it's a good example of the fault is fairly equally divided.
If you negotiate and beat the dogs.
I had the pleasure of interviewing David Gilmour once, and I just said to him, so was the final cut as bad as everyone makes it out to be? He just said yes. I also said it's fairly grim to listen to, and he said you should have been making it.
The combination, open the priest hole, and if I'm in, I'll tell you.
When you start in rock and roll, that's sort of the #1 album, you know, particularly in the States, is one of the most easily identifiable goals. And so when you've done that, then you have to reassess your attitude to all those kind of things, and how you feel about going on pursuing that goal again and again and again, or what it is that in it that's important to you. And I think that my feelings about what it is in it that's important to me solidified after that time. Having had that success, there was a difference at that point which never got resolved.
After the final cut, I think everybody thought that was the end of Pink Floyd. There was no will to pick it back up again. There was no initiative. There was complete inertia. Roger Waters was always going to work again because he was driven. He was driven to make new things, to make new records. This was not necessarily true of the others. They were not driven in that way. You couldn't call David Gilmour a driven individual. I think he made his solo album really because it was expected of him, as indeed the rest of them did.
I think when About Face was made, Gilmour certainly must have thought Pink Floyd were over. I mean, he still wanted to be in Pink Floyd, and the relief he finally had when Waters got out of the picture so he could continue to be Pink Floyd. But I think at this point, they were all making, you know, Pink Floyd felt very old all of a sudden. And I think that was, you know, all to do with the leap of technology in the 80s, and it was like Gilmour was ready to embrace it. But it's interesting, again, in the contrast, the tours they both did afterwards, where Waters had his pros and cons of hitchhiking and was still doing a stadium tour. Gilmour was happy to turn up to Hammersmith Odeon and Birmingham Odeon and not even sell these places out, and just turn up and play his solo albums with a couple of Floyd songs thrown in.
The last few years had been such, I mean, the whole of the 80s, really, essentially, had been torture. Roger torturing himself and torturing us, and frankly, when he decided to get out of it, it was a relief. You know, it was a relief when he got out, and I had told him consistently that I would carry on without him if he went. There was a point when he started saying, well, he'd come and sit in the back of the control room every day, but that's before he actually officially left. He said, if you started up without me, I'll come anyway and f*** you up. So, well, he eventually decided to leave, and I think he was trying to, in making that statement, he was trying to force us into saying that we'd pack it in and wouldn't do it anymore. But I told him before then and after him that was not my intention, and that I would get it together and do it again. And I started sort of planning at that time. I started planning at that moment that he left for what and how and when to do it.
Inevitably, in a band like Pink Floyd, there's a lot of jealousy builds up and rancour and backbiting, and as I'm on record often saying, I think bands tend to stay together far too long because it's safe and comfortable, and you have a guaranteed sale of concert tickets and records and things like that because the brand name is very powerful. But I stayed far too long.
I mean, it's a wonderful idea that these lovable mop-tops all get on with each other, and the reality is people are always sort of falling out and needing to go and do different things and work in different ways.
I didn't see why we shouldn't carry on. I'd been in it since I was 21 with these other guys.
It was when Roger Waters declared Pink Floyd dead that David Gilmour decided that they were not dead. In fact, the Pink Floyd were a partnership, and that any two people could continue that partnership, a subtlety that was lost on Roger Waters. He had no right to kill the band, was their view, and they would prove this by doing a Pink Floyd album without him.
There was not much written about Dave Gilmour and Nick Mason's allegiance to Rick Wright, but certainly at the time he was going, I think they were undoubtedly contractually bound to deliver product to the record company. And they were anxious to keep it going. I think there must have been immense sadness in the band at this particular time. I think there always is when you have legal wrangles with people who were your best buddies. What happened though was that Gilmour and Nick Mason retained the rights to use the name Pink Floyd. Rick Wright was back in the band, and it was on we go.
Into the distance, a ribbon of black, stretched to the point of no turning back. A flight of fancy on a windswept field, standing alone, my senses reel. A fatal attraction is holding me fast. How can I escape this irresistible grasp?
I didn't want to get into a huge slanging match, and I didn't want to get into a court action or any of that stuff. I just wanted to get on with my life. I mean, I failed to see, as I still fail to see, what I did to make Roger upset. I mean, it was my life as well as his life. It was Nick's life as well as his life. We, both contributed in a very large scale to what Pink Floyd was, and trying to dissect the whole of Pink Floyd and analyse it and say who did what precisely in what proportion and who added the salt to the mixture. It's a pointless exercise. The fact is, it was my career, and I had no intention of stopping. So like I say, I still fail to see what I did to him. I just wanted to carry on with what I did for a living, in the way I've been doing it, and so he started all that legal shit, which I never. It was just a pain in the arse to be working hard trying to make a record, writing, recording, when the phone would ring every 2 minutes and it would be the lawyers on with this detail or that detail, which was a very good incentive for moving to Los Angeles, where the office hours are not in sync with the English ones, so that we could get on with it with less interruptions.
Gotta keep my eyes from the circling sky, tongue-tied and twisted, just an earthbound misfit. Ice is forming on the tips of my wings.
I went to Greece on my Easter holiday with my kids and family and stuff in April of '86, and there I was actually starting to physically write down what I wanted to do, lyrics, start writing lyrics and stuff. And then we started that album when I came back from, again, a summer holiday in Greece, and had my new studio put together on a boat in Hampton. And we met up there, I think, in must have been probably, I think it was the 1st of October or something like that in '86. We started putting all these demos and bits and pieces together with me and Bob Ezrin and Nick and stuff. We co-wrote 3 songs. He came up with the lyric and the idea for On the Turning Away, and he came up with the lyric and idea for Learning to Fly, and I came up with the idea and the start point for The Dogs of War, which we then both worked on. He came up with Learning to Fly because I was learning to fly, and every time it was a nice day, he would get to the studio at about 11 in the morning, and I wouldn't turn up till 1 or 2, having been up in the skies. And so that song just came out of that. But we were as Pink Floyd learning to fly again.
There's no sensation to compare with this. Suspended animation, state of bliss. Can't keep my mind from the circling skies. Tongue-tied and twisted, just an earthbound misfit.
A Momentary Lapse of Reason was perhaps rather cruelly dubbed the facsimile Floyd by several people, particularly those in Roger Waters' camp, of course. There's an element of truth in that. Certainly, David Gilmour struggled to create what Roger Waters had done with the Floyd. To be fair, he didn't try to emulate it. There was no grand concept behind A Momentary Lapse of Reason. But then the age of the concept had pretty much gone by the mid-80s. It was more about individual songs. Gilmour was able to get those together. He needed help to do it. He needed help in the musical department and the lyrical department. But he still had the biggest trademark of all, which was his guitar.
I think the musical differences can be summed up in one word, and that's melody. I think where Pink Floyd were working as a 4-piece, maybe not with Animals and maybe not with Sections of the Wall, but up to that point, it was a very strong melodic offering, even when they went off wandering into the avant-garde, etc. And The Wall, Final Cut, and if you look at Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which was originally destined to be a Floyd project, there isn't many tunes on there. Where suddenly, when you went into Momentary Lapse, and more so on the Division Belt, you were back in this warm wash of Pink Floyd that many people knew and loved, placing it somewhere between Medal and Wish You Were Here.
Of course I was frightened. And I got as many of the old team of people around me as I could to help, I was frightened. Yeah, I didn't know if I could do it. I don't think we announced it was a Pink Floyd album until about Christmas, because those first couple of months we were working away, and I didn't know if it was going to make it. And it was around the Christmas period we started having about enough stuff to start thinking that we could do it, and we then committed to it. And then it sort of all stepped up a gear, because I thought, now it is a Pink Floyd project, and we will go for it on that basis. But I was quite tentative about it in the first 3 months.
Beyond the horizon of the place we lived when we were young, in a world of magnets and miracles, our thoughts strayed constantly and without boundary. The ringing of the division bell had begun.
I think the Division Bell was. I think a lot of the post-Roger Waters stuff was good. I just think that people tend to criticise it because it's not Roger wasn't involved in it. But actually, I think that it's still Floyd. It has the sound, it has the atmosphere, it has the genre, it has everything about it. It still works as a piece of music. It was massively successful as well, whether people liked it or not. Done massively well. The tours did massively well. They could still go out today, they could go and make another album, they could put it on the road, do the shows, and it would still be massive.
I think The Division Bell is undeniably Gilmour's record, but there is a lot more equal involvement. What's loveliest to hear is Richard Wright sort of back writing, singing, the vocal blend is there again. So yes, I think The Division Bell is a really together record.
The grass was greener, the light was brighter, the taste was sweeter, the nights of wonder, with friends around us.
There's a more coherent structure about the album as well, in that it is dealing with specific topics. So the writing, the lyrical writing, because they're written by one person, The Division Bell is a much more focused affair in that sense.
What is interesting about it is that the sound and the production are actually greater than the songs. Without Roger Waters' wonderful songs, you don't have some of those lyrical and melodic things that, you know, were the highlights of Pink Floyd's career. But that great analogue sound, a lot of it was done on Dave Gilmour's boat Astoria in Hampton. The sound is wonderful. It's back to the classic Floyd sound with those huge walls of synth backgrounds. Dave Gilmour's guitar sound, which incidentally has never really changed throughout all of the albums.
I would love to think, and as many people would love to think, that Live 8, you know, was a new beginning for the group. I think we've found it was maybe now a sort of very pleasant blip, and you know, by now these are, I don't want to say old men, but these are men in their late 50s and 60s now, and some of the heated words of 20 years ago seem a little ludicrous. And there was certainly, you know, a feeling of healing and absolute euphoria when they played. The atmosphere was absolutely electric. And I know Waters looked a bit like a sort of, you know, dad that walked out on the kids when they were about 6, and then he was invited back to Christmas dinner when they were all in their early 20s and have their own lives. And they actually don't need him now, and they're over him, but they'll never quite forget him because he brought them into the world. And there was that sort of slight imbalance, because now, you know, it's Gilmour's show, and I think Waters, if Gilmour said, okay, you know, come and join us and we'll go and do it, he wouldn't hesitate. Maybe he'd make the noises of hesitation, I don't know. And it's interesting because there was the Syd Barrett tribute earlier this year, and again, you know, all 4 were on the bill, but Waters was very separate from the other 3, so I don't think that the healing was that complete.
I don't think we'll see Pink Floyd again now. I think it's very unlikely we might see them. If we do see them again, it's likely actually that it will be for a similar event like Live 8, where they will perform as a one-off, and they will perform 4 or 5 songs. They might even do a whole set. They might even go out and play the whole of Dark Side of the Moon again, as Roger Waters has done on his last tour. But I don't think that we will see a version of Pink Floyd without Roger Waters, led by David Gilmour again, because I think that he's more interested in doing other things now. I think that the effort of putting another Pink Floyd tour together, it would be 4 or 5 years, which at his age is a long chunk out of your life, particularly if you want to be doing other things and other projects, solo albums, solo tours, other projects, writing, playing with other people, which he hasn't done a lot of, and I suspect he may want to do more of.
There are still things to do. The sum is still greater than the parts. That's what it boils down to. But there are things that can be achieved with a band that cannot be by the individual, or any individual, I think. If there's no aspiration and if there's no interest or no enthusiasm, then the thing is dead anyway.